It's time to look at the weekend newspapers, and to help me make sense of the headlines, I'm joined by broadcaster and host of the Eusebius Mckaiser show on 702, Eusebius Mckaiser, and of course the editor of the City Press, Mr. Mondli Makhanya. Mr. Makhanya, thank you so much for joining us. Eusebius, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Let's get straight to it. The City Press today, of course, I'm not afraid of jail, Jacob Zuma. Mr. Makhanya, is this a stuck record?
Very much so. I think, it is a big story in the sense that, look, we have the National General Council of the ANC in June. And what the Jacob Zuma supporters have found, or the people who are opposed to President Cyril Ramaphosa have found, is something to rally around right now.
Like a little lightning rod.
Exactly. And what the warrant of arrest that was issued by Judge Daya Pillay a month ago in Pietermaritzburg has given them that, and they've found something in which to have a grievance around, and they've been working it to its maximum. And yesterday was the first. Yesterday, when former President Jacob Zuma arrived back from overseas, was the first time that they were able to rally the forces around, and we had about 1,000 people at the airport as a show of support, the show of demonstration, to say, here we are a collective, and we are the anti-Cyril Ramaphosa forces, and we are the pro-Jacob Zuma forces, and this is what we are saying. I mean, they've given them the title of RET forces.
Yes.
Basically, it's essentially...
It's a faction. Let's get straight to it.
From pre-Nasrec that has now reconstituted itself.
Eusebius, what do you make of the story, but more importantly, the issues that Mondli has pointed out, the drivers for this? Is this a sneak into the kind of opposition that Cyril Ramaphosa is going to get in July?
I don't know what to make of this story. I keep flipping between wanting to find my non-existing inner Chinua Achebe and describe this for what it is, which is at the level of just political aesthetics, absolutely obscene melodrama. And then I think to myself, but what's at stake here is so real and serious for our countries that you dare not only lampoon it, you've got to get into the minutiae. And I think if we do the latter, because it is the most important thing to do, what we are seeing here are, as Mondli rightly says, the remnants of the corrupt forces and the state capture here, criminal networks that clearly do not want to go away, that cannot be shamed, and that aren't scared of various processes from SIU investigations to also the Zondo Commission. So it's a really important story, not because it's a story we can laugh at with a really nice picture of Jacob Zuma wearing dark glasses, but I think what we see here is precisely the fact that at Nasrec, President Cyril Ramaphosa had a slim victory margin, and because of that, that contestation inside the state and the ANC continues, and nothing less than our democratic edifice is at stake in this story.
Now, Mondli, you are writing this week in your column about what stands, what's the choices before Tito Mboweni, and of course we know this is the big week for the budget. And you are essentially saying that Mr. Mboweni must grasp the nettle, but he is hamstrung by these very divisions that we see on your front page.
No, absolutely. The budget, which is this coming Wednesday, is actually a much more important occasion than the State of the Nation, which happened 2 weeks ago, which is actually a show.
Yeah.
Before, more than anything. And we have a situation in this country where we have a crisis, a massive, massive crisis. We're facing the abyss. And the president of the country is unable to make key decisions. The administration of the country is unable to make key decisions because they are basically bound by the fact that the ANC is divided. Ramaphosa is afraid of the forces that may want to remove him before he finishes his term, or may want him to be a one-term president. And unfortunately, he squandered the political capital that he had in the first 2 years. And now that he's actually has to face the big decisions, he's unable to do so, the decisions that he should have taken at the beginning.
Eusebius, you're nodding.
Yeah, I'm in agreement, because I'm thinking, as Mondli is speaking, in a weird kind of way. Obviously, the buck stops with the president in terms of him being the CEO of SA Nkarima. But the bottom line is that money, money, money is what needs to be behind the narrative of the State of the Nation address. Now, we got sidetracked because of Silly de Klerk. We got sidetracked because of the children, otherwise known as the EFF MPs. But at the heart of the SONA, there was some stuff there looking forward that are projects worth celebrating as potential things that might be able to ignite the fire of the economy, such as an infra spend over the next 10 years, billions of rands that could make a difference to try and get the sluggish economy to be growing. But every single thing the president says that we've not debated because we were distracted will depend on what happens in the budget speech and whether or not there's money in the coffers. So in a sense, although there was drama this past week in the political news cycle, the forthcoming week is critically important, because the bigger burden is actually not on the president, but on Tito, whether he's able to support the narrative of the president with numbers.
Okay, let's not focus only on the City Press. We obviously have to also look at the Sunday Times. They are looking at a big consumer issue, of course, in the country, which is the crash, what they call crash test dummies. And that goes to something that very few people actually get behind, which is the safety of our cars and the safety of our roads. This is a huge issue for thousands of South Africans and consumers, Eusebius.
I like this story, Karima. You know why? For the same reason that you often make the point in relation to corruption. When you look at what's happening at Eskom, you shouldn't just look at the most famous names, but in the details of the organization of Eskom, how it's all over the place that you have corruption. The same goes for other parts of our society. If we're not law-abiding, if manufacturing companies aren't on board with basic standards, if we assume that manufacturers are in fact compliant with world-class standards without checking, then we might be fooling ourselves into believing that all is well. And the front page story makes the point that there are many European countries, for example, where things like ABS, when it comes to excellence in your brake system, or whether or not, you will be having, when there's a crash that happens, whether or not airbags will come out for the passenger side and also for the driver, whether there's compulsory legislation to make sure that's in place. And it turns out that is not the case. And so although there's a lot of political stories on page 1, 2, 4, and 6 that we could speak about for 30 minutes, I really like the fact that the editor chose this story.
Okay, Mondli, your take on the fact that often we hold government to account, but in this instance, this story actually shows you that it is not just the public sector that is rotten. There's a lot wrong with our private sector, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think we've seen in the price-fixing cases, for instance, where the private sector has actually been committing much bigger corruption. I mean, like, we don't call it that. We call it price fixing, we call it collusion. And actually...
And that needs to stop. And it stops with our headlines, eh? So we should call it corruption, not collusion. Absolutely. Okay, let's take a look at the Mail and Guardian. And of course, it says, stay in China. A very, very big story. South Africans trapped in China, the government saying the Chinese must be left to deal with the problem. Mondli, your take on that?
You know, that story, I think of the stories of this week. Like, as Eusebius said earlier on, we're distracted by all the other noise. And I think it's so fundamental because it speaks to humans.
Yes. People.
And there are people who are stuck there, but because our governments and African government and other African governments are so tied and so beholden to China that they are not able to make decisions about their own citizens.
But let me ask you, Eusebius, and let me go against the grain of what Mondli is saying, although I understand the thrust. Isn't it important to let the Chinese deal with the matter instead of bringing South Africans home that could place the entire population at risk?
Yeah, I get what Mondli is alluding to, and I wouldn't disagree with it entirely. There's a geopolitical element, but I don't think that's the bigger part of it. For me, what's interesting about the Mail and Guardian's story that one can read on pages 4 and 5, and it's a really fantastic entire spread, the entire newspaper this week, is the fact that it again is one of those stories that is a window through which we can understand our entire country. There's such incredible inequity within health in our country, that this is one of those stories where it doesn't matter whether you are wealthy, whether you are a middle-class citizen who's not wealthy, but you are still on the nice side of the Gini coefficient. If we were to be bringing back citizens that potentially are infected, no amount of money will be able to protect us against an overall health system that isn't ready to deal with this kind of crisis. And that to me is interesting, because very often as middle-class citizens we think we can buy ourselves out of danger. But this story is scary because it's one of those stories that remind you that the infrastructure of your health sector in the country and around the region, your border controls, etc., it's a reminder, particularly for privileged people, that unless you actually get behind the project of enabling the state and helping the state to develop itself to a place where it's capacitated, that all of us really need to think a little bit twice about being indifferent towards the state of the state.
Mondli, which brings us back to your column, the question of the budget. That is the biggest story, right? So we've just interviewed the Department of Basic Education and Amnesty International's report, Broken and Unequal. Money isn't the problem in terms of education. They get the largest slice of the money. Are we getting bang for our buck when we do budget allocations, tight as it is?
We are getting bang for our buck in terms of where we put the money, but how the money is spent, we are definitely not getting bang for our buck. And education, I mean, like, and it's been said over and over and over again, that basically the outcomes that come out of our education system do not reflect what we put into it. And the system is very, very broken. We have a story this week, which is a very heartbreaking story about a school in PE.
Exactly.
Yeah, where $2 billion has been spent on this particular school and nothing. And the school is sitting there and the classes are leaking, but there's a school that's sitting next door that the children cannot move into. And there are millions, not millions, but thousands and thousands of stories like that throughout the country where poor children are being failed, whereas money has been spent, money has been allocated, money has been spent, but
absolutely. Eusebius, you've got 30 seconds to close the show. Your take on what to go forward to this weekend?
The most important issue this week coming up, Karima, is going to be the budget speech. But I think it's very important for us as South Africans to realize that what happens between the major speeches is more important than the major speeches, because they become gigantic events, but the actual work of active citizens and of those who are seconded into the state is what happens in between.
Absolutely. Mondli Makhanya, Eusebius Mckaiser, thank you so very much for joining me. Well, you've had your fix for the week. See you again next week. Thank you for watching.